possibility of 3 Big Ten teams. You really couldn't justify moving Virginia Tech up, and if Clemson loses, they're probably out. So I think the big question really is, how many teams does the Big Ten get in, and what happens if Washington or Clemson loses? Which of those other 3 Big Ten teams get in? Michigan, number 3 in its division, or Washington, Penn State, whoever wins the Big Ten championship game. So that's really what I'm looking for, and I'm looking to see what the committee does if Washington or Clemson loses.
Let's stick to that scenario right there, Mike. Clemson loses, Colorado wins the Pac-12. You think that Colorado is going to be left out because obviously right now the Big Ten has 4 teams ahead of Colorado. Colorado would have the conference championship, which it appears based on 2014 and 15 is a huge factor in its favor, but maybe not so much as we go forward. You think the committee would go for the 3 teams out of the Big Ten?
I don't necessarily think they would. I think that's the conventional wisdom. If Clemson and Washington lose, I think the winner of the Big 12 championship game, whether it's Wisconsin or Penn State, moves into the 3 slot. I think that's automatic. Now, if Clemson and Washington loses, I think there's an argument to be made that Colorado moves into the 4th spot and jumps Michigan and the loser of the Big 12 title game, which I think is obvious. The loser of the Big 12 would move below Colorado if they won. But if Colorado wins, here's why that big jump is possible. If Colorado wins, that will give them a win over the number 4 team, which would be their best win of the season. Again, when you go back 2 years ago to the Ohio State movement, one of the reasons Ohio State was able to jump those 3 teams is because they won against a highly ranked team, something like 59-3, or it was a huge win against Wisconsin, and that enabled them to make that 3 rank jump. Colorado can do that. They've got wins against the 18 and 20 team right now. They have 2 really good losses, the number 5 team and the number 11 team, and then that win against Washington would give them a win against the 4 team. Now, the stumbling block there is one of those losses is to the team that's number 5, and that's ahead of them. So the committee would have to justify Colorado with the same record moving ahead of Michigan, who beat them by 17 in Michigan earlier in the season. I think the committee could justify that based on Colorado's overall body of work, which is what I think the committee focuses on most, and that conference championship really enhances that overall body of work. So I think Colorado could move into that 4th spot if Washington and Clemson both lose.
So in your mind, Ohio State's in regardless?
Yes.
Okay. If Penn State wins the Big Ten championship, they obviously, as has been discussed all week, would have the Big Ten championship and would have the head-to-head over Ohio State. But you still feel as though Ohio State would be selected by the committee. But do you feel if you had the choice, who would you select?
In the scenario of Penn State winning and Washington and Clemson both losing, in that scenario?
Let's say chalk is the result in the ACC and the Pac-12, and Washington and Clemson win. Penn State wins. What do you think happens there?
I keep it as it is. I think Alabama's the 1 seed, Ohio State's the 2 seed, Clemson's the 3 seed, and Washington's the 4 seed. Again, overall body of work is very important to me, and I think it's what really guides the committee. And that one loss with a conference championship with Clemson and Washington, I think is more impressive than a 2-loss conference champion in Penn State. Again, here's Penn State's problem if Washington and Clemson hold serve, is they lost to Michigan by 39 points. I think that's Penn State's big problem.
Yeah, and the big problem for the committee is that what you just cited, to a certain extent, is that Michigan on the sideline, having lost the biggest game of the year, is still 10-2 and has the head-to-head over 3 of the participants in this mess right now with Penn State, Wisconsin, and Colorado, and possibly over a conference champion in 2 leagues. So that would be an interesting thing, although the people at 538.com believe that Michigan's got like a 1% chance of getting in.
Yeah, Mark, I kind of agree with it. I don't know that Michigan really has a path, and I'm not saying as I see it, but I think as the committee sees it, I'm not sure Michigan has a path, and here's why. Once you get down to this, and you really have to get into the nuts and bolts to really figure out who's 3 and who's 4 and who's not going to get in. The one thing that I think really hurts Michigan is they only played 3 games outside of the state of Michigan this year. They lost 2 of those 3 games. I think that's what's in the end. I think that's what's going to kill Michigan's chances of getting the playoffs, that they lose 2 of the 3 games they play outside of the state of Michigan.
I would hate to see Penn State get left out as a conference champion with a head-to-head win over a playoff participant, and I would hate to see multiple conference champions not get into the field. It's funny to me that Ohio State basically had the same season this year that they had last year, except they lost to Michigan State the week before the Michigan game, so just 2 weeks removed from the end of the season, versus losing to Penn State and having time to recover from that loss. But basically, Ohio State's done the same thing that it did last year, but the committee has set itself up in great position at number 2 and really made it difficult for them to move them down outside of the playoff, having set them up at number 2, defeating number 3. How in the world do you drop them to number 5 after they just beat the number 3 team in the country?
Right. And, you talk about Ohio State 2 years ago, Ohio State last year, and then Ohio State this year. I think while the Ohio State situations might be similar, but the results are different, I think that's more about the other teams than it is about Ohio State. And, 2 years ago, you had the Big 12 fiasco, the Bob Bowlesby fiasco with one true champion, ending up being 2 non-true champions with TCU and Baylor. That's really what cost the Big 12 that year, enabled Ohio State to get in. Of course, they went on to win it. But this year, with Ohio State, it's not so much that Ohio State is not the division winner, because they really were tied for the division win. Penn State won the tiebreaker. That's different than Michigan. Michigan did not rely on a tiebreaker. Michigan was third in the division. Ohio State can claim that they were kind of a division winner, where Penn State won the tiebreaker. But what's going to help Ohio State this year is Penn State had 2 losses, one of which was against number 25 Pitt. So Ohio State's 1 loss is really outweighs Penn State's 2 losses, particularly when one of those was a 25th ranked team.
So my last thought here, Mike, concerns Michigan, because I think this is kind of a battle of wits, of logistics and how you view things. But you can obviously stack the teams based on wins and losses, and then differentiate the teams that are 10-2 or 11-1 based on resume. Or you can look at it this way. If you're going from week to week, this same college football playoff committee that ranked Michigan number 3 dropped them to number 5. Well, a number 3 team in the country that went on the road and played the number 2 team in the country to a tie in regulation, took them to 2 overtimes on the road, basically outplayed them. Maybe the game came down to a foot measurement in the second overtime. Isn't that what's supposed to happen when number 2 and number 3 play? And number 3 gets dropped to number 5, while the likes of Clemson and Washington are beating up on Washington State and South Carolina.
Yeah, and that's a fair argument from the Michigan perspective. The Michigan strength of schedule is clearly better than Washington and Clemson's, particularly with Michigan having a really good win against Colorado, 17-point win against Colorado. But then you turn around, if you're the Michigan fan using that logic, then you really have to hesitate using that logic, because then you have Wisconsin right behind you, who has an overtime loss to Ohio State, which is essentially equal to your loss to Ohio State, and then has a 7-point road loss to Michigan in Ann Arbor, and then Wisconsin is a division winner and is potentially a conference champion as well. So again, that's why I think 538 has Michigan having a 1% path to the playoffs, because those teams behind them, whatever logic Michigan uses, there are teams behind them that if they win the championship and one of those teams in front of them loses, they can use that same logic and actually have a stronger case for the playoffs. That's why I think Michigan's path is very tight right now.
Ellie Moretta Felice, who writes for Black Shoe Diaries, it's the SB Nation platform for Penn State, will be joining us in just a minute. I'm sure he's got some things to say about his Nittany Lions and their chances to make it. So, Mike, quickly, before we let you go, you've talked about the scenarios, what could happen, what should happen, what do you think will happen this weekend, and then the selections on Sunday.
Yeah, Mark, I think it's going to be exciting. I look at those games. I think Washington and Clemson are both overvalued as favorites. Washington 6.5, Clemson at 9. But the two games I'm going to be really interested in are the MAC championship and the AAC championship. Because if Western Michigan loses and Navy wins, there's a potential. Kind of articles today written about it. There's potential for the bowl selection to be almost the entire bowl selection to be put off for a week. So watch that. On championship weekend, the Navy game has tremendous impacts for the college football landscape, the entire landscape of college football.
Mike Loveall from Last Word on Sports. Check him out at lastwordon.cfb.com. Last Word on College Football. Mike and I match wits from time to time, and I enjoy the conversation, even though I'm typically a loser when we match wits. But, Mike, appreciate you jumping on board tonight.
Mark, thanks for having me.